Well, perhaps we'll make a start, because I'm sure people will filter in. It's great now to introduce the Revd Margot Hodson, who was, until a few days ago, I think, chaplain of Jesus College, Oxford. And she is in the process of moving to become Vicar of Haddenham, Cuddington, Kingsley and Aston Sandford in Buckinghamshire, the Diocese of Oxford, so not a million miles away from Oxford, and not a million miles from where we'll be tomorrow, actually. She's been involved in full-time Christian ministry, lay and ordained, for 16 years, and has worked in adult education. And she graduated first of all in geography, and then studied theology after doing geography, and her emphasis has been on the Jewish background to the scriptures. So we're, I think, getting a little bit of an Old Testament perspective from Margot as well. She is a director of the John Ray Initiative, as is Bob, who spoke earlier on, and she's a member of SAGE, which is Oxford's Christian Environment Group. And she's married to Martin, who's here and who's also a lecturer in environmental biology. So great. Wait a minute, I've got their book. Do have a look at the book and think about that for your collection. Cherishing the Earth, How to Care for God's Creation. And it's a foreword by Sir John Horton, former chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Thank you. Well, before I start my talk, I just thought, since you've got the leaflets in front of you, I'll say what was going to come at the end of the second talk, which is about Hope for Planet Earth. But I thought while they're fresh in your hands, you can have a look. There was a Methodist evangelist called Rob Frost, who very sadly died about 15 months ago. And in his last year, his vision was to run a national tour to alert the church to issues of climate change. And being an evangelist, he had an evangelistic team who were very good at running national tours. And so he asked John Ray Initiative to be involved, Christians in Science, a Rocha, Tier Fund, and one or two others. And they ran a 4-week tour last year, going to 20 venues over 4 weeks. And my husband Martin was the resident scientist, though I think resident didn't exactly sum it up. They did schools by day, a church meeting in the evening, often to 200, to in one case 400 people. Then they piled everything into the cars and went off to the next venue. So they went from Penrith to St Austell. Sadly, Rob Frost died about 5 months beforehand. He was very keen for it to go ahead, and his son Andy stood in his place, who was a brilliant youth worker background and was particularly very effective in the schools. It was so effective that they've asked for it to come back, and Hope for Planet Earth 2 is going to be running this February and March. And there were many people saying, you haven't come to our region. And so because of that, it's going now from Hamilton to Ealing, with various ones in between. And you will notice there is Cambridge. So there's no excuse. You can save the planet. And there is the place. There's a website for Hope for Planet Earth. If you can take the leaflet, you can easily look up and get the information. But do bring people along. It will be a very succinct and easy to understand presentation that is well worth bringing people to hear at introductory level. It's also will have a member of Tier Fund, a member of Rocha, Martin will be there from JRI, and other experts around, so it'd be good to invite all sorts of people too. So that's the Hope for Planet Earth talk. I'll just put up my other PowerPoint. Yes, I'm actually chaplain of Jesus College for another 2 weeks before I go off and become a vicar. In a sense, doing a fieldwork aspect of many things I've been doing since I've been at Jesus College. And looking at this issue of balancing human and environmental concerns, how do we weigh the balance between those two? Every week in our news, we hear about situations of enormous human need, just unbelievable human need in parts of the world. And also the sort of major environmental crises, and that voice is getting louder and louder, I think, this century. And balancing those is a very complex issue. It can't go down the simplistic lines of going all one or all the other. It just doesn't pan out that way. And many Christian leaders also have maybe the further question of how do we authentically respond to our world in mission? Is doing green just jumping onto a secular bandwagon? And where should we put the emphasis of our care? How does everything fit together theologically? And my background is from a missions background, originally trained at All Nations College, before women could be ordained. And that gave me, I think, a very, with my geography background as well, a very sort of applied, sort of global aspect of how we approach being church in our world today. So I wanted to think it through that way in terms of looking at environmental concerns. Now, to give you an outline of this talk, first of all, I'm going to set the scene, look at the issues, and particularly look at 4 of the major environmental issues that we're facing at the moment. And then look at a little bit at the biblical theology. I'm going to skim Old Testament. I'm very fond of the Old Testament, so I couldn't leave it out totally, even with Hilary. I usually do a very in-depth talk in the morning, but I'm just going to do a little bit of that to give us a foundation. Mainly concentrate on New Testament doctrine, and then from there look through into the ethics to see how we can develop a kind of Christian ethic of engagement, how we can actually develop a specifically Christian response to the environmental issues that we have at the moment. Then to look at something at church mission statements, theology and ethics in practice, and then responsibility and hope. So quite a lot to get into, and I hopefully take you through all of that this first session. The second session is going to particularly focus on our book and how we approached it there, but I hope to use that to show how you might approach it in a parish situation, in a ministry situation, how you might integrate some of these ideas into your life and ministry. My key conclusion is that we as Christians have a message of hope. I think if it's one word that has become the core of all those involved in environmental issues, it is the word of hope. And I think that's going to be very significant increasingly as this century moves on. 20 years ago, the greatest global fear was the nuclear winter. And I think if you look at the media, you'll find the major driver now for global catastrophe is climate change. And you might say, what's the reality of all of this? Is it just hype? Well, I think there are, in fact, 4 major environmental factors to take into consideration. And the first, very definitely, is climate change. Now, I'm hoping, I didn't get here in time to hear Bob, but I'm hoping Bob will have given you a good introduction to that. The temperature rise this century is likely to be between 2 and 4 degrees. It could possibly tip up to 6. If you want to know what that looks like, a book by Mark Linus called 6 Degrees won the Royal Society Award for the Best Popular Science Book last year, and it's very well worth reading to get more and more scared as you look at what happens as these degrees rise. And it's, of course, not just simply about getting warmer, it's about the climate changing, about the atmosphere becoming more vigorous, and so more floods, more droughts, more of everything, if you like, happening. So climate change is a major, major factor. But also we need to think about biodiversity loss. Those countries that are called underdeveloped countries have been trying to develop, and much of that trying to develop has been to use their natural resources, which is, of course, the natural world in which they live. Quite understandably so, the West has also tried to exploit those natural resources from other countries in the kind of international global market system. And the result is there has been an accelerated loss of some of our most precious biodiversity hotspots in the world in the last particularly 15 years. The speed of loss of forest cover particularly has just been accelerating, and countries like Indonesia, Borneo, Brazil, many of the African countries have just lost areas that were completely forested, have just been cleared, with enormous environmental implications, and indeed implications for the local people living there, who are not benefiting necessarily from this at all. So biodiversity loss is having a huge impact on the planet. Then human population. 100 years ago there was 1.7 billion people. In 1960, when I was born, there were 3 billion. In 2001, it hit 6 billion, so it doubled its number in my lifetime. And by 2050, they're predicted to stabilise at 9 billion. And I think we have to ask, what is the carrying capacity of the planet? Not simply in can we feed everybody, but at what cost of the rest of the environment? And is that sustainable? Is it actually ethical? How can we actually cope with this human population? How do we cope with that ethically? It's a huge question for Christians, I think, to ask. Then finally, resource depletion. Oil, water, rare metals, soil, all these things are, if you like, melting away as we try and distribute them amongst more and more people, and as we have higher and higher expectations of standard of living. We're predicted to meet peak oil, which is where production cannot keep up with supply, where supply can't keep up with demand, in the next 5-10 years. Some people say we may have even hit it already. What will happen when there's a greater demand than can possibly be supplied, and then the amount of oil begins to run down in terms of supply and demand? It's going to be enormous. Water's another one. And, as I say, rare metals, soil, all important. So, what are the human outcomes of the environmental problems? Obviously, industrialisation issues. I think we have 20th century expectations of development with a 21st century shortage of resources and a 21st century environment where the planet is heavily suffering from those expectations already being worked out in many countries. How do we get a 21st century expectation of development? Then major price rises as resources become scarce. We've already seen that with food and fuel. We'll get droughts, floods, severe weather events. That is a picture of some Bangladeshis in a flooded period in Bangladesh. Food shortages, environmental refugees, predicted to be very high numbers by the middle of this century. There's a research team in Oxford working on that. What can we do about that? There's very little major international agreements in place yet to handle the situation in a measured way. The sorts of agreements that are in place at the moment assume occasional catastrophes. What we're going to have is massive amounts of numbers of people needing to move. And the present legislation won't actually handle that. So what do we do about it? And inevitably, that may be the outcome. One of our history tutors before Christmas was saying when you have a large economic depression, it's very often followed by major international conflict. And you put all of these things together and you see that could easily be the result this century. So how do we engage with this world as Christians? We need to strengthen our theology of the material world. At times we've had a very strong theology of this world as Christians. At other times in history it's been much weaker, and we need to re-examine our theology and think about it contextually in the light of the modern situation that we're facing. I think we need a holistic missiology to connect these concerns together. When I was studying at All Nations in the late 80s, holistic missiology was the key buzzword. How can we actually do mission in a holistic way when we're actually authentically preaching the gospel, but we're also meeting human concerns in a way that is biblical and is also thoroughly contextual. And I think we've now got a bigger picture to think through. How do we take that a step further? How do we move that on? We need a global ecclesiology. If you think about it, the church collectively is the biggest NGO in the world, and if we could only get ourselves together instead of arguing about all sorts of things that are far less important than global catastrophe, maybe we could do something amazing. We have got grassroots outlets, if you like, in almost every country in the world. Wide coverage. And then you've also got middle and high level influence in many of those countries. A huge opportunity to be involved in our world in the most amazing way. And are we going to grasp a moment to take that? And then finally, we've got the imperative to bring this message of hope in an effective way. So let's whiz through the theology, because I haven't spent too much time on that to be able to apply a bit. First of all, I want to ask, is there a coherent biblical theology? There are in fact many theologies coming up at the moment. It's a very creative period, and the fact there's so many books around is showing there's so many ideas coming forward. How do we make sense of those? How do we then relate it to doctrine and ethics? And how do we then relate it to these concerns in an applied way? I'll just give you a little bit, almost as posters going through, the basic background, summary of Genesis 1 and 2, essential, created by God, seen to be good, issues of dominion and stewardship. If you've taken a creation course, you've looked into that in some depth, but I think the idea of a caring responsibility rather than of a carte blanche to do what you like is generally agreed as a good exegesis of those passages. The words to till and keep come up, that to cultivate and to look after, and that again is very much a sort of responsibility to care for, to look after, not at all a responsibility to ignore or to damage that comes through in Genesis 1 and 2. So I think you can bring out of that humans given responsibility for the earth. Then looking at obviously Genesis 3, the breakdown relationships, the fact that means that our actions towards the earth are a negative issue. I think we've been so anthropocentric in our faith, we have just assumed that the rest of God's creation was kind of wallpaper or a stage, and we were about human salvation. That's what God was all about, and we're very focused on us. And I think to say actually there's something a bit bigger than that. Our actions towards creation is a theological issue, and it all connects with our relationship with God and with one another, and it's getting those relationships to work that is part of our mission in the world. And we've got Tom Wright's triangle, and again, like Hilary, I prefer not to put nature, I think earth and the rest of creation, because we are part of nature, we are part of the earth, we're part of creation, just looking at the rest of creation. A missiologist, John Roxburgh, gave a summary. The God-given purpose of the church can be considered in terms of its worship, its community, and its responsibility towards its environment, both people and creation. And that was in revisiting the missionary nature of the Old Testament. Just to very quickly take you in hat a little bit into the Old Testament, I did a study on Isaiah using a technique that geographers use, which is how people perceive environments. And it had been applied to texts as wide as Thomas Hardy and Homer, and was actually not saying what is actually this saying about nature, but how did the people perceive the environments who wrote these texts. And so that was the way of being able to uncover something that maybe was beyond the metaphors that were being used. And I found that the images were used to develop theological themes, and that they revealed an attitude to the material world. If you like, they revealed what New Iron Age people were thinking about the material world in Canaan in the 8th century. And it's quite interesting because many of those ideas are then developed in the New Testament, and which is where I'm heading, so that's why I just put that in. In 1st Isaiah, it's very clear that the idea was that nature, the earth, should be full of God's glory. It's actually under judgment, and the consequences of that are war, drought, poor crops, and briars and thorns. And if you like, those are major threats to human cultivation of the earth. But it's very clear that it did not see nature itself as inherently sinful. That's something that's come into our thinking very, very much from other sources. But perceptually, nature was seen as being something very positive, something very good, but something that had been, if you like, badly damaged. And so you've got the sense of relationships being abused, and that relationship between God, people and planet, once it's abused, has sort of bad effects in all directions. Going into 2nd and 3rd Isaiah, you've then got images of rejoicing and fruitfulness. Deserts rejoice, vineyards become fruitful, there's blessing on crops, even animals honour the Lord. It's amazing, there are 160 species of animal mentioned by name in Isaiah. You can't exactly tell which species they are when you try and translate them, as Hilary said, but it's an amazing number of species. Certainly a detailed interest in nature is apparent from the book. The earth, the holy mountain, is the dwelling place of God and full of glory. And it all results from a restored relationship of humans with God. And that comes through with a renewal of creation and a promise of restoration. So this sort of perception that is revealed is that at times when the relationships are all out of sync, are all sort of rent asunder, that will, if you like, be mirrored in creation. At times when those relationships are put together, the sense is that with creation will find some form of wholeness. Now, if you look at that doctrinally, first of all, it's important to be aware while creation is used here and in Genesis and in other parts of the Old Testament, it's always used to underpin monotheism. It was at a time when they were moving from monoltry to monotheism, and it was to actually try and emphasise that. It isn't that there is a God of a mountain and we worship this God who's the God of Israel. It is that our God of Israel created that mountain, and therefore there is no God of the mountain because only our God, the creator of all. And it's important to look at that and to see that as creator God. There's a strong sort of monotheistic theme coming through. There's also a strong theme between creation and redemption. They're almost always linked. It's talking about God the creator to then talk about God the redeemer. And you might say, is creation subordinate, foundational, or inextricably linked to redemption? And that's been a popular theme for sort of PhD theses to actually work those out. And it comes back to Von Rad, who saw creation as very much subordinate in his early work. And he actually said that it was but a magnificent foil for the message of salvation. Now that came because he saw salvation as something that was a human-centred thing, and creation as something that was for all creation. And so all creation happened to create humans, to then have this salvation of humans. And then, if you like, the rest of the creation was obsolete. It didn't actually need to be there because it had been there to generate humanity. That might be slightly overstating where he was coming from, but it gives you a sort of a thumbprint of where that's where he was. And I think the question is to ask: is redemption just for humans, or is it for the whole cosmos? Is there something bigger that is coming out? Because if redemption is coming out for the whole cosmos, then you've got something that is bigger and in fact very exciting that's coming through from the doctrine that's coming through in Isaiah. Just then quickly looking at relationship. This redemption is shown as leading to future harmony, and I think you've got those wonderful sort of metaphors of that summed up in places like Isaiah 11, Isaiah 65. It shows the intrinsic worth of nature. The 10th century rabbi, Moses Maimonides, worked out a painstaking argument to argue how nature was not, the rest of creation was not put together for the sake of humans, which was the popular medieval view, because there are parts of God's creation that were of no benefit to humans. It wouldn't matter if they were not there. And he worked through this to show that nature was actually there for the glory of God and not purely for humans. So the idea that God had created this wonderful world just for humans to use as they wanted, which was a popular medieval view, was something that he, right back in the 11th century, sort of questioned because of the idea of intrinsic worth, which is another one that's strongly argued and thought about today. The wilderness, you find, is a place where you meet God, but not actually a place where you live and work. And looking at a lot of the issues between the preservation of wilderness areas and, if you like, conservation issues of conserving more traditional human affected landscapes come out of that, and something we can think about a bit with that. Humans fulfil our role to take responsibility, and the sense that actually it's quite interventionist, that we are here to take responsibility for our world and to get involved in it, to farm it, to work it, to be a part of it, and not to be afraid to make changes to our natural world, but to do so in a responsible and a sensitive way. And if that happens, the rest of creation will flourish and God will bless the harmony. So how is that developed in the New Testament? I just want to look a little bit at John 1, because I think it's a key passage for this. It's, of course, one of the lectionary passages for Christmas, so we've all just been through it. Many of us will have preached on it. And for me, it's either Christmas that I remember or my Christology exams, because it was one of my set passages that I wrestled with. And I think it's quite refreshing to look at it in the context of the environment and what it says about that. Well, first of all, it's very strong that it says that creation is from God and is good. It says that the Word was the agent of creation. All things came into being through him, and without him no one thing came into being. So the whole of creation looks to God for its source. It comes into being through the agency of Christ. And the passage goes on to say that in him was life, and that life was the light of all people. And this light shines in the darkness. I think the implication of that is that not any part of creation is darkness. Maybe that's a kind of the non-creation that you have in Augustine's thinking, and that might be an interpretation of evil. But it's not God's creation. Creation was created to be good. Creation was created to be light. Jesus became part of creation and affirmed its goodness. The second point is that we can find that there is a very, very high doctrine of the incarnation, and that has implications for the environment. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus was without sin, so to become flesh, his flesh must also, have been without sin. So Jesus became a part of creation and again affirmed its goodness. And I think that is an incredible affirmation of the inherent goodness of the material world. If it's sin coming into our world, not the material world, that is the problem. And so you might say, well, why have Christians sometimes had a very low view of the material world and of nature? I think we need to look at some of the other influences that may have been operating. And I guess I'm much more of a Hebrew than of a Greek person. And so I find it very easy to see the origins of a negative view of creation coming from a kind of shift from Greek to Hebrew thinking, and through to some of the Greek dualisms that came in with the early church and came in again at different times. They came in the Renaissance, they came in the 17th, 18th century when the Neoplatonists came to the fore again, and brought some very powerful, very useful things, but brought this sense of a dualism between soul and body, spiritual and material, and it's very easy to see one as good and the other as evil. So that led to easily to a thinking of being spiritual meant sort of transcending this world, whereas being material was something of a lower worldly, earthly order, if you like. And you still find that in some of our spiritualities. You still find that coming through, an idea that kind of somehow meeting with God was kind of escaping from this world to be with God, rather than meeting him here, rather than meeting him in this world. And those views, I think, have also influenced other faiths. It's not just the Christian faith. Judaism, Hinduism, others have had those sorts of dualistic views come in. And I think where we see a very negative approach to the material world, where we see a very narrow approach to mission, as if you like, only looking at soul, never looking at body, comes from an overemphasis on that dualistic view and not having a much more holistic view of God and his salvation. And perhaps if you want a proof text beyond that, you need the word became flesh and dwelt among us. If we need any affirmation for this world and being involved in it, it is that basic verse. And what that does is connect a high view of the biblical doctrine of creation with a very strong historical and physical belief in the doctrine of the incarnation. And that has the implications for the way we see salvation, but ultimately also the way we see redemption of the whole cosmos. And if we think back to what Van Rad was saying, I think if you look at that statement in John 1, I think then creation must be something more than a foil for a later drama. It's something more fundamental than that. And we can also look at the doctrine of the resurrection and what that has to say about the environment. And you're either a fan or can't stand Tom Wright, I think, in theology at the moment. You go one way or the other. If you take on board a lot of what Tom Wright is saying, his view of a bodily resurrection gives a very strong affirmation to the material world, and he's built quite a strong sort of ethic of social engagement on that understanding. And I think if you follow him, you should make Christianity a very earthed religion. Restores relationships in the garden. If you look at that very beautiful picture of resurrection, which comes from John's Gospel, of Jesus being mistaken for the gardener, of him being discovered by Mary, I think you have this concept of the, if you like, the Garden of Eden restored coming out, and think of the implications of that. But also of hope and promise for all creation, because what is Jesus doing? He's doing what we are all called to do, to till and to keep the earth, to care for creation, if you like. Now, you want to overstretch that, but that is that sense of that re-engagement with the natural world. So take that further into Romans 8, and this is one of the purple passages for anyone involved in environment. And you find that there are two powerful images here that will give a concept of what creation is looking for what the biblical writers are looking towards. You have to realise that just as with the Old Testament prophets, the writers of the New Testament really didn't have any particular interest in environment. They would not have been dashing to join Friends of the Earth had it existed. They would have been thinking in very different ways. Their concept was of what was happening cosmically. They were looking a lot towards eschatology, towards the end times, and they were looking at creation in that context. And so you get a very cosmic image of creation when you look particularly at the New Testament epistles and at Revelation. And there's this sense of creation being liberated from its bondage in Romans. And they were looking, I think, almost certainly for something like those pictures that you saw in Isaiah, the sense of a perfected peace on earth, end times harmony that was going to come, and creation is groaning and pointing towards that. They probably also had that very much more overlapped view of creation and society. So they would probably have seen creation groaning in the pain of humanity as well as, if you like, in anything ecological. That would have been possibly higher on their minds. So the sense of the tremendous pain and oppression that people were facing would have been very, very much part of their thinking. There's also a concept of a woman in childbirth in Romans 8:22, and I think that is also very cosmic. It's an illustration of the cosmic woes that will accompany God's judgment, and is a metaphor here for, if you like, that universal pain that accompanies new life. And it's used in other books of this period or just before it. Books like the Book of Enoch has that very strong view of a woman in childbirth, waiting for, if you like, the cosmic end. And Martin and I, as we were writing our book last year, when it was published, one of my colleagues said, well, it's a bit like childbirth, but a bit different, because with childbirth it's easy till you get to the birth, and when the birth it's really painful and dreadful. But when with a book, it's really painful actually writing the thing, but when it actually arrives through the post and you've got it published, that's the nicest moment. And I think that's possibly the truth. That if creation is in pain as in childbirth, it's logical to expect a birth. And you have to say, well, what will that look like? Well, it's hoping, Paul is looking to see the freedom of the glory of the kingdom of God, a full redemption. And in just the way I believe in a bodily resurrection, I think the freedom that creation will come into will be a kind of material bodily redemption, however that will work. It's, if you like, this creation that's a magnificent foil will actually become a magnificent sign of God's love and faithfulness, as you see that restoration happening. And God, who became part of his creation to die for the whole cosmos, to be raised bodily, physically, as the first fruits of redemption of our cosmos. Maybe one day we'll look for a resurrection of the whole of our creation. And I don't know what that will look like, but it might be some of those passages in Isaiah and the passages at the end of Revelation give us a glimpse of something as we're trying to look towards that and what it might be. And very quickly, looking at Revelation, issues of a renewed or a new heaven and earth, of Jerusalem coming to earth, of the Isaianic future harmony. And if you like, that takes you through to having something reconciled in Christ, having those relationships now held together in Christ. And that's the passage that sums that up the best, is the passage from Colossians, which gives you that wonderful picture of all creation held together in Christ. That should give us, if you like, harmony between God, humanity and the rest of his creation. In a sense, looking to balance human and ecological needs for the good of all, and proclaiming in word and deed Christ's redemption, bringing hope. But we haven't got there yet, so what about human need? Well, when those biblical relationships are out of balance, both people and the planet will suffer. And I think we see that happening in very many places today, because you can't actually help one without helping the other. And as partway into the Darfur crisis, in fact, the John Ray Initiative were approached could they give some environmental response to the situation, because the development agencies had met the human need, but actually by not also looking at the environmental need at the same time, they were then hitting environmental catastrophe because of the amount of people and animals that have been brought into one place. And they were then thinking, how can we actually deal with this together? The same thing sometimes happens with environmental organisations who just look at the environmental need and don't look at the human need. And it's actually bringing those two together that is important. And if we can actually do that in a biblical way, I think we'll see wholeness coming to both. Now, I started at 22, so I'm hoping I can go to half past. Is that all right?
I can allow that.
Good. So I want to bring you a model for ethics that originally came from somebody called Lloyd Quass in the States, who was developing it as a model for mission. And a tutor called Larry Maddox in Prague, in the International Baptist Seminary there, developed it as a sort of model for ethics, for teaching ethics to his students. And I think it works very well to look at environmental ethics. And it starts by having a core truth in the middle. What are your core things that you believe? And it then looks at what values and virtues those generate. Going on from that, it says, well, if you've got those values, what laws and precepts do those engender? It's very much, if you like, a virtues ethics type approach. And then looks at some of the real situations and decisions that you might encounter. And so to look at that in terms of environmental ethics, for a Christian environmental ethic, I've put my little triangle with Colossians 1 in the middle of that, this sense that God holds all of creation together, that it is his creation, that there is value to all as that sort of central thesis. And then looking at some of the virtues that would be, values that would be, if you like, generated from that, will be ones that affect humans and ones that affect all of creation. Then taking that through into laws and precepts brings, I think, a very holistic, very engaged form of mission, and then should take you into some of the actual situations that you might face, and that as a means of engaging with current environmental situation, using environmental ethics, if you like, missiologically, I think it is one that can work quite well. So you just start from your values and work out. And when I teach environmental ethics, and I actually give people blank sheets of this to actually put in their own, and they put them in various different ways. It's a secular course. It's on a ones come from different faith backgrounds and from various different origins. But it's actually looking at that. How in the end do you tackle those practical issues? What is actually generating your response? Now, to look at some of the mission statements we have around, I've just picked out a few. This is from the Baptist Church, who have as their fifth... Sorry, Anglican, I meant the Baptist Church. Here you are. Oh, I've lost the Baptists. Right, just got Anglican here. This is the Anglican 5 strands of mission, and I've often called these the best kept secret of the Anglican Church, because they have been not heavily used. They were used as a basis of Lambeth last summer, and I think quite a lot of progress was made on that. But they are an incredibly good basis of mission, because they've got it all there, if you like. If you use that and develop that, you can find that you don't miss anything out. I think people who get incredibly excited about social engagement or environmental engagement, people sometimes fear that they'll lose actually, preaching the good news. And those who get really excited about evangelism, as I'm actually very excited about evangelism, will find that people fear that they will lose that more sort of social end of the spectrum. And it's actually saying we need all of these working together. You need all of these strands working in one to actually have a really good practical mission statement. This is from the Methodist Church, which also has got, this is from the Methodist Church of Ireland, a very similar mix of things. They've put worship, nurture, evangelism and wholeness has got the environment as well as human life. And there's the Baptist Church. It's obviously slipped down my list. And that has various different statements. It has got within it, I think, a sense of the environment, perhaps not so well put out as some of the other ones, but it is there. This is the Church of North India. which is in translation, so it doesn't come through quite smoothly. But I think it does give a real sense of the need for restoration. The picture is of a girl who has been trafficked into a brothel and is looking through the window, and I think that sort of says where much of the engagement of the church is at in India, looking at incredible exploitation of people and of nature, and how can you actually deal with that. Development agencies have, if you like, the core aims of relief of human suffering, and because of that it's kind of been quite hard for them to shift and to also look at environment in an integrated way. I think it's much easier, if you like, for the church to do that because it isn't sort of tied to one particular strand. And the ones are going in different ways. Tear Fund, I think, has been an example of excellence of the way they have taken on the environmental strand without having lost much of the rest of their strengths. And it's very interesting. They're very much behind the Hope for Planet Earth tour. So I think development agencies are moving forward, and it's as they come together with environmental agencies and as the two come together that we're going to find a response that will practically work internationally. So I think we need to take responsibility. God's given us a responsibility to care for this planet. I think it should be central to our thinking. I've put there a picture of Noah because I think that life on Earth as we know it is actually under threat. The changes in our climate, the changes that are going to come about through biodiversity loss, through population rise, through resource depletion, are so enormous that by the end of the century we can't live in the way that we're living now. We've got to be living in a different way. And I think just as Noah was very prophetic, so we need to be prophetic, but hopefully we need to actually have a message people will respond to. We don't want to leave them all behind and get onto some metaphorical ark. We want to actually have something that will be one that will engage. And I think the question is, will we be proactive in this, or will we be reactive? Will we actually make a change, or will we wait until the secular world around us is doing so and then just try and keep up with it? Most of you here are going to be, or are already, in a position of leadership in Christian communities. And you have got a key task in that. You've got a key opportunity. And it's how you're going to respond to that. Just conclude with a message from 2 Chronicles and the sense of hope that God is going to bring to all of us. And then I'll just put up some questions that I think are raised, which you can look at, or you can ask any other questions as I come to an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margot. Over to you. Yeah.
Well, we were talking this morning about the global south, and it's very obvious it's rapidly growing, the church is being established. But I wondered whether there isn't a real contribution that we could make into the global south in situations like that, of being able to bring this message where I'm absolutely certain that it really isn't part of the teaching there yet.
I think there are 2 aspects to that. One is that, yes, and that's something that we're working on. We're doing some work with CMS and with OCMS, and we're sort of seeking to have that and to develop it. I think we have to also, though, be very careful that just as in the 20th century we had the answers that we went down to Africa and tried to work out, that we don't again try and go with that. So it's working with people and going and working as partners with churches in the global south as they seek to find the solutions. And it's doing that in quite a sensitive way. And the theology in many places has taken on board, if you like, that very anthropocentric theology and isn't in the least bit concerned about the environment. And somehow, how can we actually support they can come to a more holistic view without actually being too, if you like, colonial in how we do that. But we are finding pastors are coming to us and approaching us. In fact, possibly Martin might be able to say a bit more about that than me.
Yeah, I've just taken on supervising the guy for the Oxford Centre for Mission Studies, who's a Nigerian pastor, and he did a master's at Redcliffe Bible College, and in that he did this whole unit on the greening of mission, and it so fired him up, and he said, well, there is nothing happening in Nigeria on this at all. How am I going to do it? And so he's actually now starting his doctorate, looking at first of all the environmental issues in Nigeria, and then how to engage the church there in these issues. So it's starting to happen. But I think, as Margot says, it has to come from Africa and from these other countries, rather than saying, well, we've got the answers, let's give them to you. If it comes to us, then I think it's really valuable.
Thank you.
There are quite a few complexities with that, such as in a lot of these countries they're saying, well, you chop down your trees, why? And that's how you got wealth, because you have good farmland, or why shouldn't you chop down ours? And there's big issues with that are very complex.
Well, the whole thing to do with our lifestyle, full stop,
yeah,
I think,
everything.
in a sense,
Yeah.
The wealth that we enjoy. More questions? Must be more.
How do you think you can encourage people to take a more creation-centric approach to creation, I guess, when having had an anthropocentric approach to creation, people still in the Western world quite often don't give a toss about people who are dying in Africa or Asia. I think that must be a real struggle. I wonder, does putting an environmentally centred approach, does that even deflect further away? Are people less likely to engage with, if people in the States and Europe?
I think sometimes people can see it as a deflection, and I think that's been the worry of quite a lot of the development agencies, that if people get involved in the environment, they won't, the huge numbers of people dying of AIDS or something just won't get the funding, because it will all be going for environmental concerns. And I suppose you've got to say, well, you've got to give people credit for being responsible and intelligent, and if they do see that this is a real issue, that they will respond. I think you do see that in the church in a way that sometimes you don't see so broadly in the wider community, that there is an awareness of Christians in other countries and them suffering and difficulties, and perhaps it's building on that and working on that. But I think it is always bringing the message and then seeing how people respond. And there will be people who respond negatively, those who respond positively.
In your opinion, is this something which needs top-down governance and control rather than grassroots uprising, or what does combination to?
Probably something I'm going to say a little bit more about in the second talk, but I think it actually needs both, which is where I think the church is quite well placed for it. Because we are both. But I think unless you have both, I don't think you'll actually necessarily get it to work.
By using the word hope, are you technically adopting that term, or is that a realistic adoption of the term?
Probably a bit of both, actually. It is a little bit tactical in the way that, humanly speaking, I used to know sort of an older man in a church I used to go to on a housing estate who would always say, in the natural, he would say. And I think in a sense, in the natural, it's a very bleak century that we're facing. But if you look at Scripture and you look at the promise of resurrection and Jesus' words to us, then there is an enormous hope there, an enormous hope that actually this is an opportunity, not a disaster, if we can meet it. People are beginning to use the word overdeveloped And I think our overgrown culture, and often our overgrown sort of sizes that have come from that culture, have not brought us happiness. And in a sense, if we can grasp this moment, we have got something amazing to do, and something amazing as Christians to do this century.
Yes. More questions?
I was thinking about your downsizing of the church in the 21st century, going around various churches, which I do, and looking at the cars that are parked in the road outside or in the church car park. I don't see a great deal of evidence where I am in South Cheshire of downsizing going on, nor do I see that in the congregations. It seems to me that the demand of self-sacrifice, which is central to the gospel, is going to be the only way in which we meet the challenge of hope.
Yeah.
It simply won't be happening by us kidding people that what they do is good for them as well as the world and the environment, so let's do that. Because that's not a sufficient motive to confront the challenges that we do. So it seems to me that the Christian Church should be, theologically, addressing the very challenging Christian gospel, that only by dying do we live. I don't see this being exemplified in the behaviour of church members, to be honest, perhaps even in myself.
And I guess we should be theologically equipped to do it, and motivationally equipped, maybe in the way that others aren't. I mean, we've signed up to be Christians, and so we've signed up to die to hope, to self, and to live for Christ. And yes, as you say, you do look at lifestyles and look at our own lifestyle, and you think, well, actually, is that true? Does that happen? It's very much harder when you're in a church where everybody has the latest car and the latest kitchen and the latest whatever, and have just flown off to Florida for the holidays. It may be more straightforward in a church that is actually seeing living a simple lifestyle as a faith commitment, and is seeking to do that. And maybe still people get new cars when their car, finally dies on them, or maybe they still occasionally fly for good reasons. But and that might be a very special holiday that they haven't had for many years. But actually, to live a much, much simpler lifestyle is the call, and it is something that will need leadership. And I suppose that's something that we're going to be grappling with now, going into parish ministry, and to seeing how can this be integrated in a way that isn't going to wrongly dominate one's ministry, but is going to be something that is just part of it and integral to it. And so how can you lead to a simpler lifestyle?
I mean, it is a question that's been around for years, hasn't it? Was it enough is enough? Was that really, it is one that you actually find it difficult to actually take on board. Yeah. Any more questions? Well, we could break tea at that point if that's was the conclusion. And Margot will resume slightly ahead. After we've had our tea, which is really at the back. So thank you very, very much.